Again. I always appreciate talking to you about the latest developments with the Nancy Guthrie investigation. There's still so, I mean, I was just telling my friend, I get so many emails every day, still, even it's been months later from people so interested in this case, and a lot of older people around Nancy's age, even or in their 70s, who have just really been impacted by this. And everybody wants answers, but it's just interesting. There's a whole, I think, segment of people that are really, really impacted by what happened to Nancy and are just disturbed by it. I wanted to start off asking you, though. Fox Digital obtained some emails from the Pima County Sheriff's Office. They were working with A&E. There was going to be a reality show coming out where A&E was going to be following around deputies within the sheriff's office in Pima County and getting access to them, going out on calls and that kind of thing. And it's interesting because in the emails, they were trying to obtain certain videos and going back and forth about body camera video and asking for interviews with heads of departments. And one of the responses back to them was the department has experienced some rotational reassignments since last year. And they basically said that the head of the cold case unit and the homicide unit had moved out. So they were having some scheduling issues, which, knowing what we know now, what we learned after what happened with Nancy Guthrie, the sheriff had moved a lot of the experienced people out of the leadership roles really for political reasons, from what we can tell, people who didn't support him in the election. I mean, what do you make of the fact that this was all kind of coming to light through these emails before we knew any of this was going to happen with Nancy Guthrie?
Yeah, from my understanding, the filming, of course, happened before the murder investigation. But still, when you send them an email and they say, well, we've had rotational assignments that have taken these people, or rotational reassignments, you wonder why they had to specify that as to the reason. We just say, hey, they're no longer in that job. You know how it goes. Plus, I don't remember, at least in the FBI, rotational assignments. I mean, I suppose there are a few, but when you go into a job, you're expected to stay there as long as you and they want you to be in that position, and it's vetoable by either party.
With some of these shows, I've watched them and it seems like some of them can be good for law enforcement. They show what it's actually like to be a cop, what it's like on the streets. You sort of sympathize more with the officers. But I don't know, there's something about this that's rubbing a lot of people the wrong way. I think just since the Guthrie case is still unsolved and you see that, the leadership in the department was taking so much time with these producers before planning out this show. There's also questions like, were they getting access to public records more quickly than regular people could have? They were just sending body camera videos back and forth, that kind of thing. What's your, I guess, your general opinion of shows like this?
It's a mixed bag, Brian. As you point out correctly, it gives people an idea of what law enforcement is really like, and shows them that it's not like it seems to somebody who's just looking at what they see in the news. It is sometimes terrifying. It's always demanding. And to me, I see uniforms. The FBI has not done anything like this. And I learned more about uniformed police officers and what they have to do. So I think they're valuable there. I have always wondered how those things affect legal proceedings of the people who were arrested or detained or part of any kind of situation. I can't imagine uh, a lawyer saying, "Hey, this is a good idea for the department." So yeah, it's a mixed bag, and I can tell you that the agents I spoke with while during my career said that they wouldn't want to have anything to do with anything like that, because if something goes bad, God forbid something goes bad, um, you've done it on public record right then and there. Certainly now that there are body cams, that same thing still applies. But it's kind of like driving your car with a camera on you the whole time. Um, it's great if not until something happens that you screwed up, and then you've really caused yourself some trouble.
And just back to the head of homicide and cold case being moved out, I can't help but wonder if the people with more experience were still in those roles, if we would be in a different place now with the Nancy Guthrie investigation.
We'd be in a different place. I can't say for sure that it would have been solved. I'll bet we would have been way farther down the road and possibly solved. It's one of those what if type things. And I think the reason, by the way, that the involvement in the show bothers some people.
Before you go any further, if you are the kind of person who believes that cases like this deserve attention, that victims like Nancy Guthrie deserve to have their stories told carefully and completely, then you are in exactly the right place. Hit that like button right now and subscribe to True Crime Dav. Every subscriber, every like, helps this channel continue doing the work of keeping these stories alive. Now let's get into it. The precise details of what happened inside Nancy Guthrie's home on the night she was taken are not fully known to the public. What is known is the shape of the event, the broad strokes of a crime that investigators, forensic experts, and retired law enforcement professionals have spent months analyzing. She was taken from her home, not from a parking lot, not from a hiking trail, not from a public space where a stranger might approach her undetected. She was taken from the place where she was supposed to be safest, the place where people lock the door at night and believe, against all rational evidence of how crime actually works, that they are protected from the worst of what the world can do. Doorbell camera footage captured a figure approaching the property. This image, this single frame of reference, became the most important piece of publicly known evidence in the entire case. The figure on the camera represented the only visual confirmation that someone had been at Nancy's home around the time of her disappearance. Investigators studied that footage. Journalists reported on it. Viewers across the country looked at it and tried to understand who this person was, what they were doing there, and what happened after the camera stopped being useful. No arrest followed. No public identification of that individual was announced. The person in the footage remained, as far as the public knew, unidentified, a silhouette at the edge of a devastating mystery. What happened after the initial disappearance added another layer of horror to an already devastating situation. Ransom demands were made. Whoever had taken Nancy Guthrie, whether one person or a group, communicated with her family, and, subsequently, with law enforcement. They wanted money. They presented the kidnapping as a transaction. Pay the demanded sum, and Nancy would be returned. The message was clear enough in its structure. This was, on its surface, a kidnapping for ransom. Investigators, including agents from the FBI who became involved, given the federal jurisdiction that attaches to kidnapping cases involving ransom demands, assessed that the initial ransom communications were genuine. These were not hoax demands from someone with no connection to the crime. These came from the person or persons who actually had Nancy. Law enforcement believed the notes were real. But between believing the ransom demands were real and being able to act on them in a way that might bring Nancy home safely, there was a critical requirement, one that the FBI and professional negotiators insist upon as an absolute non-negotiable: proof of life. Proof of life is exactly what it sounds like. Before any ransom payment is made, before the family parts with money, before law enforcement facilitates any kind of exchange, the people holding the victim must demonstrate that the victim is still alive. A phone call, a video, a piece of information only the living person would know. Something, anything, that confirms the person whose return is being bargained for is still breathing. That proof never came. Whatever the circumstances, whether something went catastrophically wrong during the kidnapping itself, whether Nancy was injured or killed in the process of being taken, whether she died while being held, the people who took her could not, or would not, provide the evidence that she was alive. And without proof of life, there was no payment. There was no exchange. There was no resolution. The scheme had collapsed under the weight of its own fundamental failure. Whoever had planned this operation had committed what retired FBI agent Steve Moore described as the cardinal sin of kidnapping for ransom. They had lost their bargaining chip. They had taken the one thing that gave them leverage over the family and the authorities, and they had lost it, or destroyed it, before they could convert it into the money they had wanted. In Moore's assessment, this appeared to be an amateurish kidnapping that went wrong, not the work of sophisticated criminals who had carefully planned every contingency, not a professional operation with experienced operatives who knew how to manage a hostage situation through a negotiation and out the other side. This had the hallmarks of people who had conceived of something they did not fully understand, who had moved forward without anticipating the problems that would arise, and who ultimately found themselves in a position where they had committed a serious violent felony with nothing to show for it and no way out. That analysis did not make what happened to Nancy Guthrie any less devastating. If anything, it made it more so because it suggested that she may have been the victim of incompetence as much as malice, that her fate may have been sealed not by a coldly calculated decision, but by the panicked realization of people who had gotten in over their heads. As the investigation unfolded, the fractures within the Pima County Sheriff's Office and between that office and the FBI became increasingly visible to those paying close attention. One particular episode crystallized the dysfunction in a way that was both concrete and deeply symbolic. During the course of the investigation, a hair was recovered. Physical evidence from a crime scene. The kind of thing that, if it contained usable DNA, could potentially link a specific individual to the crime. The FBI, which had been involved in the case, and which operates one of the most sophisticated forensic laboratory systems in the world, asked to test the hair. That request was made approximately 2 months before the evidence was actually sent to the FBI's laboratory. Instead of forwarding the hair to the FBI lab, the Pima County Sheriff's Office sent it to a private laboratory in Florida, a facility located approximately 3,000 miles away. The hair sat in that private lab while weeks, and then months passed without the kind of comprehensive DNA analysis that the FBI had offered to conduct using its own capabilities. Eventually, the hair was sent to the FBI, but the delay had already generated significant consequences. Not just investigative ones, but institutional ones. The FBI took the unusual step of releasing a public statement about the situation, and the language of that statement was striking. The Bureau noted that this was not new evidence. It noted that the FBI had asked to test the DNA 2 months earlier, using the same technology it had always possessed. It noted that the local sheriff had instead sent the evidence to a private laboratory, and it concluded with a promise that any further developments would be shared as soon as appropriate. Read casually, this might sound like a routine clarification. Read carefully, in the context of how the FBI typically communicates about its relationships with local law enforcement partners, it was anything but routine. The FBI almost never publicly criticizes local partners. The Bureau's standard operating posture is one of cooperation, collegiality, and institutional solidarity with local and state agencies. For the FBI to release a statement that implicitly assigned blame to a local official for a 2-month delay in evidence processing was, by the standards of federal law enforcement communication, an extraordinary act. There was one additional detail that those familiar with law enforcement culture immediately noticed. The FBI's statement did not name the sheriff. For an elected official, someone whose entire political existence depends on name recognition, on the public associating their name with the work their office does, being pointedly unnamed in a statement about a major case was not a neutral oversight. It was a signal. It communicated, without explicitly saying so, that the relationship between the Bureau and this particular sheriff was not one the FBI wanted to publicize or elevate. Steve Moore put it plainly. The FBI was operating at a distance from the sheriff's office, and the public statement was a way of making that distance visible without crossing the line into open conflict. The question that haunted the investigation was not abstract. If the hair had been sent to the FBI when the Bureau first requested it, 2 months earlier, would the analysis have yielded results sooner? Would those results have pointed investigators toward a suspect? Would an arrest have been made? Would there be answers rather than silence? No one could say for certain. But the possibility hung over the case like a cloud that refused to move. The broader pattern that was emerging was one of an institution that had been compromised at multiple levels simultaneously. The most experienced investigators in the homicide and cold case units had been moved out for reasons unrelated to their professional performance. The department's leadership had invested significant time and energy in a television production. The relationship with the FBI, the single most valuable investigative resource available to the department in a case of this complexity, was damaged by decisions that were difficult to explain on purely professional grounds. And at the center of all of it was a missing woman whose family was waiting for answers that were not coming. The question of how many people were involved in Nancy Guthrie's kidnapping became one of the central investigative and analytical puzzles of the case. The doorbell camera showed one individual, but the presence of one person on camera did not necessarily mean one person committed the crime. Law enforcement professionals and forensic experts who analyzed the publicly available information came down on different sides of this question, and their disagreement reflected the genuine complexity of the evidence. There was a school of thought that maintained a single perpetrator was possible and could not be ruled out. Kidnappings carried out by lone individuals are documented in the historical record, and the camera footage, which showed one person, was at least consistent with a single actor scenario. But there was another school of thought, and Steve Moore placed himself firmly in this camp, that viewed the logistics of the crime as strongly suggesting multiple perpetrators. The core of this argument was practical. Managing a kidnapping victim, particularly an adult who does not want to be held, is extraordinarily difficult for one person. You cannot leave. You cannot sleep. You cannot live any approximation of a normal life while simultaneously containing someone who is trying to escape or call for help. Every hour that passes with a living victim increases the operational demands on the person holding them. Moore's assessment was that while both scenarios were possible, the statistical weight of historical kidnapping cases involving adult victims leaned toward multiple perpetrators. The presence of only one person on the doorbell camera, he noted, did not exclude the possibility of additional conspirators. There may have been evidence that had not been made public. Shoe prints, DNA from a second individual, or surveillance footage from other locations that pointed investigators in a different direction than the single actor theory. If multiple people were involved, the question of how they were organized became relevant. Some analysts proposed a structure that might be described informally as hierarchical. One person who conceived of and directed the operation, and one or more others who participated in executing it. In this model, the person seen on camera might not have been the architect of the crime. They might have been an instrument of someone else's plan. For that kind of arrangement to work, Moore explained, the participants would almost certainly need to know and trust each other at some meaningful level. Kidnapping for ransom is not the kind of venture that sophisticated criminals advertise or recruit for openly. People do not hire strangers to help them commit this kind of crime without creating an enormous vulnerability in the form of a person who knows everything and has every incentive to cooperate with law enforcement if things go wrong. The participants in a joint kidnapping scheme would more likely be friends, relatives, or long-standing acquaintances, people who believed they could count on each other, who shared some combination of financial desperation, reckless ambition, and mutual trust sufficient to attempt something this serious. That trust, however, would be tested by the reality of what happened after the scheme collapsed. A failed kidnapping for ransom does not simply end. It leaves behind people who know what they did, who know that the person they took is gone, and who are now carrying that knowledge while trying to live their ordinary lives. The pressure of that is immense. Law enforcement professionals with experience in exactly this kind of case are largely uniform in their assessment of how long multi-person criminal conspiracies can hold together under sustained investigative pressure. They do not hold together indefinitely. Every person involved in a conspiracy has a different threshold for risk. Some people can compartmentalize and carry the weight of a secret for a long time. Others cannot. And as time passes, as investigators continue working, As the possibility of discovery feels more rather than less real, the person with the lower risk tolerance will eventually reach a breaking point. They will talk to a family member, or a friend, or a lawyer, or directly to law enforcement. They will try to negotiate. They will try to shift blame. They will do something that creates a crack in the silence that the others thought was solid. Moore described it as playing chicken. Two people accelerating toward each other on the same road, each betting the other will flinch first. In this version of the game, flinching means cooperating with investigators. And historically, someone always flinches. That dynamic, the internal pressure on anyone who participated in this crime, the knowledge that their co-conspirators might be having the same crisis of nerve they themselves were having, represented one of the most realistic avenues through which the case might eventually be broken. But there was a darker variant of the conspiracy theory that some analysts raised, and that had to be taken seriously given what the historical record shows about how some criminal enterprises manage the problem of loose ends. The person visible on the doorbell camera, if that person was a subordinate rather than the architect of the scheme, might not still be alive. Cases exist in the documented history of organized crime and conspiracy, in which one participant eliminates another specifically to prevent the possibility of cooperation with law enforcement. In such scenarios, the person who knows the most and talks the least is the one who made sure the other person could not talk at all. Moore acknowledged awareness of such cases while noting he had never personally worked one. He also raised a practical complication that applied specifically to this scenario. If someone connected to the Guthrie kidnapping had disappeared or been killed in the Fort Tucson area in the months following Nancy's disappearance, that second investigation would almost certainly fall within the jurisdiction of the Pima County Sheriff's Office. The same agency that was already struggling with the Guthrie case would be responsible for connecting the dots. Whether those dots would be connected, given what was publicly known about the department's institutional condition, was a question that did not have a reassuring answer. The investigation continued. Weeks turned into months. The case did not go cold in the sense that investigators stopped working it. The FBI's involvement in particular suggested sustained federal attention. But it did go quiet in the way that unsolved cases often do. The initial media attention gradually receded. The daily press conferences ended. The public statements became less frequent and more carefully worded, and the family of Nancy Guthrie was left to wait in a silence that must have been almost unbearable. 86 days after Nancy disappeared, by one reported measure, there were still no suspects publicly identified. There were still no arrests. There was still no definitive answer to the most basic question: what happened to Nancy Guthrie after she was taken from her home? The case had accumulated a body of publicly documented facts that painted a troubling picture, not just of the crime itself, but of the institutional failures that may have compounded its consequences. An experienced homicide unit commander had been moved out of a role that would have made that person the natural lead on exactly this kind of investigation. An experienced cold case commander had been similarly displaced, a fact that would matter if the case, as was increasingly possible, went unsolved long enough to eventually be transferred to a cold case file. A reality television production had consumed the time and attention of department leadership during a period when that attention was urgently needed elsewhere. Evidence had been sent to a private laboratory rather than the FBI's forensic lab, a decision that resulted in a 2-month delay that the FBI itself chose to publicly document and criticize, using language that made the Bureau's frustration unmistakably clear. The relationship between the county's primary law enforcement agency and its most powerful investigative partner had been damaged in ways that were visible in the public record. And through all of it, the sheriff, an elected official who by multiple accounts had demonstrated a strong interest in media coverage and public visibility, continued to occupy the top of an institution that was under extraordinary scrutiny for how it had handled the most important case in its recent history. The question of whether this accumulation of institutional failures materially affected the investigation's trajectory cannot be definitively answered. Correlation is not causation. The case might have been equally difficult to solve even with experienced leadership in place, even without the television production, even without the evidence handling delay. But the alternative possibility, that different decisions at each of those junctures might have produced a different outcome, was one that serious, experienced law enforcement professionals were unwilling to dismiss. Steve Moore's assessment was careful but direct. With more experienced leadership in place, the investigation would likely have progressed further than it had. Whether that would have meant an arrest, he could not say. But the trajectory would have been different. The distance between where the investigation was and where it might have been was real, even if its precise dimensions could not be measured. For the people who loved Nancy Guthrie, all of this institutional analysis was both important and, in some fundamental sense, beside the point. They did not need to understand the politics of the sheriff's office or the bureaucratic tensions between county and federal law enforcement to feel the weight of what had been taken from them. They needed Nancy. They needed to know what happened to her. They needed the kind of closure that comes only from answers. Real answers, complete answers, the kind that a family can hold on to, and eventually, in whatever form is possible, begin to build something from. Those answers had not come. Not after 30 days, not after 60, not after 86 days and beyond. The public response to the case offered its own kind of testimony about how deeply it had penetrated the consciousness of people who had never met Nancy and had no personal connection to Tucson or to Pima County. Journalists covering the case reported receiving hundreds of emails from viewers and readers, not just in the immediate aftermath of the disappearance, when such responses are common, but months later, when most stories have faded from active public attention. A particular segment of that audience stood out. Older Americans, people in their 70s and around Nancy's own age, who had found themselves profoundly affected by what had happened to her. These were people who could imagine themselves in her position, who lived alone or in quiet neighborhoods, who had built their later years around the assumption of a certain kind of safety, who had believed that the ordinary precautions of a careful life were sufficient protection against the worst of what the world could do. Nancy's disappearance had disrupted that assumption in a way that was visceral and personal for them. If it could happen to her, it could happen to anyone. The doorbell camera that was supposed to provide security had instead provided documentation of a crime it could not prevent. The law enforcement apparatus that was supposed to respond to crimes like this had been navigating its own internal crises while the investigation unfolded. The fear generated by that combination of vulnerability and institutional unreliability was real, and it was widely felt. It expressed itself in emails sent to journalists months after the fact, in conversations between people who had never been directly affected by violent crime, in the quiet and persistent attention that thousands of strangers continued to pay to a case whose victim they had never known. That attention mattered. Cases go cold when the public stops paying attention. Witnesses who might have useful information sometimes come forward not because law enforcement finds them, but because public coverage of a case reaches them and prompts them to act. Tips that break open stalled investigations sometimes come from people who watched a story online and recognized something, a name, a face, a detail that connected to something they knew. The sustained public interest in Nancy Guthrie's case was not merely emotional. It was investigatively significant. As long as people were paying attention, the case remained in the realm of solvable rather than permanently dormant. The vehicle question was among the investigative threads that investigators were known to be pursuing. In virtually any kidnapping, the question of transportation is critical. How was the victim moved from the location where they were taken to wherever they were held? What vehicle was used? Where did that vehicle go? Are there cameras along the route that might have captured it? Can the vehicle be identified from its make, model, color, or partial plate? Surveillance technology in American cities has expanded dramatically in recent years. Traffic cameras, business security systems, residential doorbell cameras, automated license plate readers. The density of recording equipment in urban environments means that a vehicle moving through a city is often captured multiple times, from multiple angles, by multiple systems. For investigators, this creates both opportunity and complexity. The opportunity to track a vehicle's movement across a city over time, and the complexity of processing enormous amounts of footage to find the relevant images within it. Whether the investigation had identified a specific vehicle of interest, whether footage existed that showed such a vehicle, and what investigators believed that evidence indicated these were details that had not been publicly confirmed. But the question of transportation was one that competent investigators would necessarily be working, and the public knowledge that it was among the active lines of inquiry was consistent with the kind of comprehensive investigation that the FBI's involvement would suggest was being conducted. There is something almost philosophical about the moment in a kidnapping investigation when the absence of proof of life is confronted for the first time. The family is there, and they want to believe. They want to believe that the person they love is somewhere, frightened but alive, waiting for the phone to ring or the door to open. They want to believe that the people on the other end of the ransom demand are capable of keeping their word, that this is still a negotiation rather than a recovery. And then the demand comes for proof of life, and there is nothing. The other end of the line is silent, where it should offer something: a voice, a code word, a photo, anything that would confirm that the person being bargained for is still in the world. That silence is not just absence. It is information, and it is the worst kind. The FBI has protocols for exactly this situation, built from decades of kidnapping cases and the hard-won understanding of how these crimes unfold. The requirement for proof of life is not bureaucratic obstinacy. It is protection for the family, protection for the victim, and in a grim and practical sense, protection against paying a ransom to people who have nothing left to give in return. When proof of life cannot be provided, the negotiation changes its nature entirely. It is no longer a negotiation for a return. It becomes something else. An investigation into what happened, driven by the desperate hope that the investigators are wrong, that there is some explanation, some reason for the silence that does not mean what it appears to mean. In Nancy Guthrie's case, that hope appears to have been unrewarded. The public record does not include any announcement of contact with Nancy, any confirmed sighting, any communication that established she was alive after the ransom demands began. The silence on that question was itself a kind of answer, one that no family should ever have to receive, and one that the people responsible for putting that family in that position have so far avoided being held accountable for. Accountability is the word that keeps surfacing when you look at this case from every angle. Accountability for the person or people who took Nancy. Accountability for the decisions made within the institution responsible for finding her. Accountability for the political choices that left that institution less capable of doing its job than it should have been. None of that accountability had arrived as of the most recent documented reporting on the case. The investigation was ongoing. The case was open. The FBI was involved. The hair evidence was in the Bureau's laboratory. The doorbell camera footage existed. The ransom demands had been received and analyzed. But Nancy was still gone, and no one had been charged with taking her. The people who follow this case, and there are thousands of them, scattered across the country, checking for updates and sending emails and refusing to let the story disappear even as news cycles move on to other things, understand something important about unsolved cases. They understand that attention is a form of pressure, that the act of continuing to watch, continuing to ask questions, continuing to insist that a missing woman's story deserves to be told and retold and told again until there are answers. That act is not passive. It is a form of advocacy for the truth. Nancy Guthrie was a real person. She lived in Tucson. She was taken from her home. The people who took her have not been identified publicly. The institution responsible for finding her was operating under conditions that compromised its effectiveness. The evidence was delayed. The relationships were damaged. The experience was depleted. And somewhere in all of that, in the gap between what this investigation should have been and what it became, is the answer to what happened to Nancy. An answer that exists, that is knowable, that someone somewhere possesses, and that has not yet made its way into the light. The history of criminal investigations teaches one consistent lesson about cases like this. Secrets do not keep forever. The people who know what happened to Nancy Guthrie are carrying a weight that grows heavier with every passing day. The mathematics of conspiracy work against the people who would prefer the silence to hold. One person's nerve breaks before another's. One conversation goes somewhere it was never supposed to go. One detail surfaces in a place where the wrong person, from the conspirator's perspective, the right person, can find it. The FBI's forensic capabilities, deployed in full in the testing of physical evidence, represent another avenue through which the truth might emerge. DNA analysis has solved cases that went cold for decades. The technology that exists today, applied to evidence that seemed insufficient at the time it was collected, has produced identifications that put people in prison long after they believed they had escaped consequence. The case is not closed. The investigation is not over. The people responsible for what happened to Nancy Guthrie have not gotten away with it permanently. They have simply gotten away with it so far. There is a meaningful difference between those two things, and the people who love Nancy and the thousands of strangers who have followed her case with the kind of sustained, determined attention that refuses to let her become just another forgotten name. They understand that difference, and they are holding on to it. Nancy Guthrie deserves answers. Her family deserves answers. The people of Tucson deserve to know what happened inside the quiet neighborhood where a woman was taken from her home in broad daylight, or the dark of night, or whatever moment it was when everything changed, and nothing has been the same since. The case carries within it every fear that ordinary people carry about the safety of their own homes, the reliability of the institutions meant to protect them, and the possibility that the worst can happen to anyone, at any time, without warning or logic or mercy. But it also carries within it the possibility of justice, the possibility that the evidence exists, that the witnesses are out there, that the moment when someone decides the silence is no longer sustainable is closer than it seems. The possibility that the next phone call, the next DNA result, the next moment of conscience from someone who knows more than they have said, will change everything. Until that moment comes, the only thing that the rest of us can do is what the people who have followed this case from the beginning have already been doing. Pay attention, keep asking questions, refuse to let the story fade, and insist that Nancy Guthrie's name continues to be spoken and heard and remembered. She was a real person. What happened to her was real. The people responsible are real. And the truth of what they did is real, waiting somewhere to be found. If this story affected you the way it affected so many people across this country, then please take a moment right now to like this video and subscribe to True Crime Dav. Every single subscriber helps this channel continue telling stories like Nancy's, stories that deserve to be heard, cases that deserve to stay in the public eye, victims who deserve to have their names remembered long after the news cycle has moved on. Hit that subscribe button. Share this video with someone you think should know about this case. And stay with True Crime Dav, because the work of keeping these stories alive never stops. And neither do we.